This week on the Communicators, two industry perspectives on an effort by the FCC to regulate broadband services. Our guests are Walter McCormick of U.S. Telecom and Cathy Sloan of the Computer and Communications Industry Association.
Well, as the Federal Communications Commission moves closer to reclassifying broadband services as a Title II telecommunications service, we are joined by two representatives of industry who will be talking about that this week on the Communicators. Walter McCormick is the president and CEO of the U.S. Telecom Association. Mr. McCormick, first of all, tell us about your association and what is the harm that you perceive to your member companies if broadband is re-regulated as a Title II?
Well, we're the Broadband Association. We represent the nation's broadband service providers. We provide service in urban areas and rural areas on both a fixed and mobile basis. We have several hundred member companies, as big as AT&T and Verizon, and as small as serving a couple of hundred consumers.
And what harm, if broadband is reclassified as Title II, what's the harm that you see or that you perceive to your member companies?
Well, if you think of the analogy of zoning, broadband basically has been zoned for enterprise. It's been zoned for development, and what we have seen is just extraordinary investment and innovation and job creation. The FCC has said that they're going to rezone, and in rezoning they're going to apply a regulatory structure that is the most pervasive economic regulation type of structure that has ever been designed in the United States. It was designed for a monopoly era. It was born of 19th century railroad regulation, and it was applied to the old telephone industry when there was essentially a monopoly provider, and in return for that, the government pervasively regulated all rates, classifications, and services of the industry.
But again, what's the harm to your industry?
Well, it impacts our ability to be able to move deftly and quickly and to be able to innovate and to be able to serve customers and to meet developing consumer needs. And so what it does is creates great regulatory uncertainty and uncertainty for investment. So what we have seen is that analysts on Wall Street have cautioned about investment in this industry because they're unsure of what services and businesses the industry will be able to offer and not be able to offer going forward.
Cathy Sloan is the Vice President of the Computer and Communications Industry Association. Ms. Sloan, what are the benefits in re-regulating broadband services to Title II for your member companies? And tell us about your organization as well.
Well, yes, let me first say that CCIA represents a diverse array of companies in the computer and communications industries. They include, at the large end, Google and Microsoft and Yahoo, Oracle, Intuit, T-Mobile, Facebook,
So what are the benefits that your member companies would see if broadband is reclassified?
First of all, let me clarify that we're not looking for regulation. Our association has been around for 40 years, as long as the internet itself, since before the breakup of AT&T and the antitrust case. And our members have always, they're all business members. They're not nonprofits, they're business members. And they want us to support open systems, open markets, open networks, and competition. I didn't mention we have smaller companies like XO Communications and Integra and Data Foundry. And so what we want to see is protection for consumers and small businesses and nonprofits so that they have non-discriminatory access to the internet for their daily personal and business activities.
Is the way that broadband is currently regulated, is there harm to your member companies?
It's not currently regulated at all. Our view is that the Internet Policy Statement of 2005, which the former FCC put in place as a consensus move to replace Title II regulation, is what needs to be maintained. That policy statement spelled out consumer rights to access any content or applications or services online using devices of the user's own choosing, and a very substantial consensus developed around that policy statement. And the Comcast case, which is why we're here, was about the FCC trying to use just Title I ancillary authority to enforce that policy statement, which the court said wouldn't fly.
Do you view broadband as a common carrier?
We view the telecommunications networks that carry the traffic on a two-way basis, both the telephone companies and the cable companies that offer two-way telecommunications for internet access. Yes, we view that as common carrier.
When Mr. McCormick says that the current regulatory structure is built from the 1930s and for a monopoly era, do you agree with that, that it is it's outdated for today's telecommunications world?
It's true, it was built a long time ago, but Title II completely survived the massive update that was the Telecommunications Act of '96, in which at the signing, President Clinton and Vice President Gore talked about the importance of the information superhighway. They weren't using the internet so much per se, but they knew, everybody knew, the legislators knew that advanced services were the way things were going. They were hoping to get more local competition. They were replacing antitrust restrictions on the bell companies and with pro-competitive regulatory provisions that would promote competition, and that's when we got all the CLECs that developed. But the fact remains today that in most markets around the U.S., we're dealing maybe not with a monopoly, although some are, but more typically a duopoly for wireless internet for wireline internet access.
In 1934, the government decided to regulate the telephone industry. And it said to the telephone industry, you shall have a monopoly. And in return for that, you will not face competition, but you will have regulation. In 1996, Congress took a completely different approach. It said, no longer will you have monopoly. No longer will you be protected from competition. And you will be freed from regulation as there is new competition. In response to that, in our sector, there has developed enormous consumer choice. Today, we have 95% of America covered for broadband access. Compare that to the healthcare bill that just passed. The aspiration, when fully implemented, is that we cover 95% of America. Today, we cover 95% of America with fixed broadband access. No company in the industry has a dominant market share. Our entire industry has only a 43% share of access to the internet access market. Typically, antitrust standards are when companies reach 70 to 80% share, they're considered dominant. In the internet system, you have to have an internet service provider. Our whole industry has a 43% share. You need an operating system. Today, Microsoft, one company, has over a 90% share. You need a processor. Today, one company, Intel, has over an 80% share. And by and large, you need a search engine. And one company, Google, has a 70% share. So when you look at the entire internet ecosystem, the most competitive part of the ecosystem, the place where the consumer has the greatest choice, is with regard to internet access. The irony is that the FCC only has authority to regulate in this one little area. And what we are suggesting is that there is no problem that requires the kind of pervasive regulation that was aimed at a time where our industry was insulated from competition. Because what we have are statistics showing that 91% of consumers are satisfied with their internet access. What we're seeing by the FCC's own statistics is that 80% of consumers can choose between two fixed providers, and 90% of consumers can choose from among 5 wireless providers. So At this point in time, we think that, do not impose stifling regulation in an area of the economy that's creating jobs and is the innovative engine for the United States economy.
But the FCC, Julius Janikowski, has said that he only wants to use, under Title II, six of the regulations is all that he is proposing to impose on broadband providers.
Yes, and the first of those regulations is Section 201, that says that the Commission shall have authority to regulate all prices, all practices, and all classifications regarding this business. It is the most pervasive grant of economic regulatory authority that has ever been granted in the United States because it was designed for a monopoly environment.
Do you see
To that point.
In 2 seconds you'll be able to respond. Do you see broadband as a common carrier
No,
at all?
no.
Why?
Because broadband is designed as a competitive business, and the broadband offerings that are provided are not as was said over 10 years ago by Chairman Bill Kennard. A broadband offering involves a combination of the transmission component, the addressability function, and a variety of other services that the consumer demands, such as firewalls and protection from viruses. So this is a different animal than the kind of pure transmission component that was available for voice telephone service.
Cathy Sloan.
The fact remains that most consumers and small businesses today look to their cable or telephone internet access provider for a connection to the internet. Once online, we can access a multitude of competitive services for everything from email to spyware to e-commerce and movies and whatever it is. It's true that the cable and telephone companies provide some of those of their own, which is another competitive option, but you can't get to all the other applications, services, and content except by using a cable or telephone internet access provider. Now, with the exception of wireless, but even though a lot of American households have dumped their wireline phone in their homes, nobody dumps their internet access connection, their wireline internet access, in favor of only their mobile phone, at least yet. Maybe in the future that will be the case. But the thing Walter was mentioning about Section 201 of the Act, which is the first part of Title II, in fact, many of the smaller rural telephone companies operate under Title II today, even though they also offer broadband. Likewise, the mobile wireless cellular providers are Title II carriers, and they're not complaining, and they're not trying to get out from under Title II. So back to your question, what's the big harm?
Well, we're not opposed to anyone choosing to operate under whatever regulatory and business environment that they want to. In a competitive market, people should be able to choose the way in which they want to provide their service offerings. But what we have here is the lack of any problem that requires this kind of governmental intervention. And we have a variety of interests saying the FCC is pursuing the wrong approach. A majority of the United States Congress has said, don't do this. The weight of opinion on Wall Street is advising, don't do this. Newspapers such as the Chicago Tribune and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal are saying this would be a mistake. So what we have is a situation where we have a very dynamic sector of the economy that is meeting consumer expectations and is driving really the kind of GDP growth that the nation needs. And we have now the FCC coming forward with a proposal that creates such uncertainty that it threatens to chill that very positive economic activity.
There is a problem, and that is that the Comcast case ruled that the FCC's Title I approach to enforcing the Internet Policy Statement does not fly from a legal standpoint. So we're left with a situation now where consumers, small business, nonprofits are completely without recourse if their internet access provider should slow, block, or degrade their service, or intrude on their privacy, or charge them double what their neighbor pays for the same bandwidth and service, even cuts off their service entirely. Without any FCC basic rules of the road over provisioning that telecommunications link on a non-discriminatory basis, internet users have no recourse. And that is why this FCC has proposed a middle ground between Title I and full application of Title II, so that consumers and small businesses can have some certainty that they're going to be able to continue their online activities without prioritization based on the commercial preferences of their provider.
Do you think, Cathy Sloan, that, or does the Computer and Communications Industry Association think that broadband services should be price regulated?
No, we don't. There are some public interest organizations that believe not only should there be rate regulation, but there should be wholesale interconnection requirements like they have in France and the UK. We do not, again, we are open systems, open government, free competition, as little regulation as possible. But we do believe that this Title II light would be the best balance.
So when Walter McCormick says that there is a lack of a problem here, do you agree with that?
No, I don't agree with that, and I describe the problem for consumers having absolutely no recourse even at the FCC under current law, which is the Internet Policy Statement is unenforceable and there's nothing else. And in terms of certainty and Wall Street, the one area where the telephone companies have the greatest certainty is that there's no one out there who can challenge their massive market dominance. Now, it's true they don't have nationwide market shares of 95% because all the territory is carved up. AT&T and Verizon do not challenge each other in their wireline businesses in the same territory, in the same geographic markets. But nobody can seriously challenge these companies that have been around since the early part of the 1900s. And in fact, companies like T-Mobile and Sprint have to rely on networks owned by their largest competitors for a lot of their traffic transport. And mark my words, no third network is going to be built. It hasn't happened anywhere in the world because of stubborn basic economics.
And I would say that, again, there's no problem at this time that requires government intervention. We believe that consumers should continue to be guaranteed the freedoms they enjoy today. The ability to access any website, to run any application, to attach any lawful device. There is not a single complaint before the FCC today that says that there's somebody barring that. The only real concerns today do relate to privacy. And those concerns relate to Google, they relate to Facebook, they relate to the dominant market shares that those companies enjoy in that market. And under this FCC proposal, there's absolutely no authority being granted to the FCC to regulate the privacy concerns that consumers have about those kinds of operations. So we have been supportive of Congress updating the laws, taking a look at this internet ecosystem, making sure that the FCC has sufficient authority to guarantee consumers the ability to enjoy the freedoms that they have today, but to be able to do it in a way that empowers the consumer to make sure that the consumer feels safe when he or she uses the internet, and that the consumer has the ability to decide what information he or she may or may not want to share with others.
This is C-SPAN's Communicators program. Our guests are Walter McCormick of the U.S. Telecom Association. He's the president and CEO. They represent such telephone companies as AT&T and Verizon. Our other guest is Cathy Sloan, vice president of the Computer and Communications Industry Association, representing such companies as Facebook, Google, and Microsoft, etc. You mentioned Congress, Mr. McCormick. Do you think Congress needs, do you see a vacuum right now in telecommunications law or regulation? And do you think it's time to update the 96 Telecommunications Act, the 1930s Telecommunications Act, for the current environment?
Yes, we support an updating of the laws because the internet was really not the subject of the 96 Act. The 96 Act was largely about competition and voice communications. And as I've said before, to use the internet, you need to have an operating system, a processor, a browser, a search engine. And the concerns that consumers today have really relate to their freedoms on the internet, their safety in using the internet, and the protection of their privacy rights with regard to the internet. The FCC does not have authority in those areas. The FCC has not been approaching the internet as an ecosystem because the FCC's historic authority relates simply to communications by radio or wire. It does not relate to these larger issues that are now involved with the internet.
Communications by wire or radio includes regulation on such things historically as CPNI, Customer Proprietary Network Information. And those were rules having to do with what information about a phone customer's conversations or whatever could be used by the telephone companies. So it's just a fallacy to say that only websites like Google and Facebook, for example, I guess were the ones mentioned. It's a fallacy to say that those are the only businesses about which consumers are concerned about their privacy. It's a fact that internet access providers, be they telephone or cable, have access to information about every activity that a consumer pursues online, whether it's their email or search or whatever. And the FCC does have jurisdiction over network level privacy. You know, there are all kinds of other rules that apply to what privacy rights that users have with respect to government access to that information that they come to the internet access providers.
And in fact, in your brief to the FCC, one of your subchapters is the Commission should require that all two-way internet communication services must be made available on a standalone basis. Why do you include that?
Because the dominant market position that the internet access providers have with respect to individual geographic markets, so you're choosing your cable company or your telephone company for your wired internet access, that because of that duopoly market power, it's too likely that a company will bundle say video content with their own internet access, and thereby making it more expensive or more difficult to reach competing content. A case in point is the Comcast-NBC merger, where, you know, if your internet access provider is Comcast, there's absolutely no law preventing them from prioritizing NBC programming and making it difficult for you to choose competing content.
Do you think there is a vacuum in telecommunications regulation, and should Congress step in at this point?
Yes, there is a vacuum caused by the Comcast case, as Comcast decision, as we discussed. And yes, both the FCC needs to deal with that in the interim immediately, because consumers and small businesses have no recourse. But yes, also the Congress should pursue updating the Telecommunications Act again. It's just that we know from experience that doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen in 2 years. So they need to get going, because right now there are no legislative proposals out there that would comprehensively update the telecommunications.
How does network regulation, network neutrality play into this scheme?
Well, network neutrality is a different animal to different people. You know, in Europe, it has sometimes a little bit more to do with whether the monopoly telecoms want to let the government get into the act of regulating content. But our overarching principle and belief, both for the United States and internationally, is that no government or private company should be a gatekeeper for its citizens or its customers in terms of their online activities.
And we would agree. We don't see in our industry anybody having the ability to be a gatekeeper. I think that Cathy's position basically is regulate you, but don't regulate me. We believe that, as the FCC has said, its authority is uncertain. When its authority is uncertain, it needs to go to the Congress to clarify its authority. And if you're going to clarify its authority, the goal should be to protect consumers. Consumer privacy needs to be protected, whether it is an issue relating to service providers, to search engines, to operating systems, to social networks. The issue of whether or not consumers are able to operate in a safe way on the internet, whether they enjoy freedoms, is something that needs to be examined in the context of the new internet ecosystem. The FCC has acknowledged it has no authority over those kinds of providers. It's uncertain of its authority over us, and so therefore it's appropriate for Congress at this point to come in and to update the laws.
I have to clarify that we have several member companies, from T-Mobile to XO Communications to Integra Communications, who are Title II carriers. So it's not regulate them and not us. It's regulate some of us and some of our other members who have never been telecommunications providers. Other laws apply. The antitrust laws apply. FTC has jurisdiction over privacy, for example, and so.
When Reed Hundt, former FCC chair, calls broadband the new national medium, what do you hear and do you agree?
I agree with that. In a way, it's the conflation of all the silos that the FCC traditionally had jurisdiction over: broadcasting on the one hand, cable, video distribution on the other, telephone services on the other, satellite. IP technology makes it so that you can do voice, data, video over any of these platforms, and it's very encouraging that the biggest operators are not slowing their investment and don't plan to, regardless of the regulatory scenario, in wireless, because more and more, despite spectrum constraints, companies will try to find the spectrum to offer the bandwidth so that perhaps wireless can become a third option to the two wired internet access choices.
Well, I certainly hear Sprint and Clearwire and other wireless providers saying to consumers that their service is fully substitutable today for internet access. We have satellite providers that are certainly marketing their service as fully substitutable. And we know that in over 80% of America, consumers have the choice between at least two fixed line providers offering no less than 4.5 megabits. And in 95% of America, they have the choice of a fixed line provider. So we have a very, very dynamic marketplace. And it's that dynamism, it's that job creation, it's that economic growth that we want to make sure is preserved.
Do you agree with Reed Hundt?
I absolutely agree that broadband is going to be the future of communications in this country. It's the future of job growth, healthcare, and quality of life. And it is going to be the dominant information source for the information age. And
finally, to both of you, I've noticed that, Cathy Sloan, in your brief to the FCC, you used the term IAP instead of ISP. Is this a new tactic, to call it an internet access provider rather than an internet service provider?
Yes, because the term internet service provider confuses folks, because services are what we think of as e-commerce activity online once you have the connection, and it's only internet access, only the internet access portion of broadband that we think the FCC should be concerned about.
What do you think about this ISP, IAP?
I think it's like trying to say that consumers should have to buy an engine and buy the starter separately, or that if you buy a car, you buy a motor and you buy a carriage. The fact of the matter is when a consumer wants internet access, The consumer wants to be able to be sure that when he plugs in a domain name, he's going to get delivered. He wants to be sure that he's going to have a firewall and spam protection. And he wants to be able to sure that he has the kind of services that he's come to expect as being what the internet is all about.
Final word.
Again, our overarching concern is that no private company and no government, including our own, should act as a gatekeeper for its citizens or its customers in terms of their online activities. And because at this point, I know Sprint and T-Mobile offer great wireless service so that you can use your laptop anywhere, but still yet, the concern is that the big telephone and cable companies do have the ability and the incentive to act as gatekeepers.
Cathy Sloan is the Vice President of the Computer and Communications Industry Association. Walter McCormick, President and CEO of the U.S. Telecom Association. Thank you both for being on the Communicators. And as this issue of reclassification continues to move through the FCC, Communicators will continue to follow it.
Up next,